So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. With me today is Gareth John. He is the Executive Chairman, Director of Accountancy Training College at First Intuition. He's also the President for ICAEW East Anglia. So welcome Gareth, lovely to have you on the show.
It's lovely to be here, Hannah. Thank you for the invite.
No, my pleasure. So do you want to just tell for our audience that may not have come across you and some of the organisations that you work with, do you want to just give me a bit of background about what you guys do at First Intuition?
Certainly. So, essentially, we're a finance college, so we train accountants. We train for the major accountancy qualifications, the AAT, ACCA, CIMA, and ICAEW qualifications. We do that all around the country, and in fact, a little bit overseas. We do it through classroom training and through online trainings. We offer quite a wide variety. We do it through apprenticeships and for non-apprenticeships. We work with accountancy practices. We also work with finance functions in commercial organisations. We work with NHS trusts, so quite a broad range actually, which is kind of great because it gives me personally quite a nice opportunity to sort of get a sense of what's going on in different parts of the kind of accountancy and finance industry.
Absolutely. And tell me, how did you end up as president of the ICAEW? What's your journey?
Well, to be honest, I originally got into accountancy, if I'm perfectly honest, because I didn't really know what to do with myself when I was kind of in my early 20s. So it was kind of strange when I was leaving university. My various friends seemed to have a very clear idea of what they wanted to do for careers, and I had no idea whatsoever. But that's actually what appealed to me about accountancy, that, I just figured every sector needs accountants, every organisation needs accountants, every company needs accountants, every country in the world needs accountants. So actually by training as an accountant, it was keeping my doors, very much open, keeping my options open, meant I could perhaps choose at a later date what I actually really wanted to commit myself for. I also like the fact that as well as that breadth of careers accountancy offered, it was also the kind of height of a career, because I was conscious that, right the way from junior level ledger clerks or trainee auditors all the way up to the board, CFOs or finance directors on the main boards of FTSE 100 companies were accountants. So I just figured it really gave me all sorts of different opportunities. I did train in audit for a national accountancy firm. And that in itself was fantastic. I'd go out to different clients every week or every fortnight, looking at their books, talking to their finance teams, sometimes getting factory tours. And for me, it was a great way to see such a diversity of different types of business, different types of organizations. It was a great grounding, as well as in accountancy itself. It was a great grounding in kind of the world of business and the world of commerce. I'd always been quite interested in economics when I was younger, when I was at school and university. So, for me, it was really a whistle-stop tour of the world of business and how organizations ran. But as it turned out, actually, after I qualified myself as an accountant, one of the things I'd really loved about my own kind of training process and my own qualification process was the responsibility I'd started taking on for training junior staff internally at the firm that I worked with. I got a real buzz out of that kind of interaction with juniors and helping them understand tasks that they were going to do. So I moved myself into professional training nearly 25 years ago now, actually, and have actually, absolutely loved it ever since. To say it's a job I've been doing for a quarter of a century nearly, I still adore, every day of what I do. Just the reward you get from helping other people through their own exams, helping them, at a very early stage in their own careers. For me, there's nothing like, particularly when I see former students going on to become partners or CFOs of organizations, to feel that you played a little role at the beginning of that career is just incredibly rewarding. And then about 11 years ago, myself and a couple of colleagues, we sort of set up our First Intuition office. And, we've grown dramatically all around different parts of the country, actually, as I said. So it's been a, really stressful at times, but really exciting and rewarding journey. And I'm so glad I chose education as a sort of direction to take in my career.
Absolutely, and quarter of a century is not bad, to be very fair. So what have you seen over that time frame? How have you seen the finance education change, or has it changed that much since you first started?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question, actually, Hannah. And I mean, in some respects, it's the same job as back when I started in the 1990s. It's fundamentally about helping ambitious individuals to start, hopefully exciting careers in finance. And fundamentally, that's still what it's around. But actually, in other ways, it's absolutely changed beyond recognition. And that's not just because we used to use old rattly overhead projectors and now we use computers. So a little bit more to it than that. I mean, for instance, a big change I've seen, particularly in recent years, is the real explosion of school leaver programs. Back when I got into accountancy, as I said, 25 odd years ago, you kind of needed a degree. The degree route, the graduate route into the accountancy profession was still by and far and away the most common approach. I felt I needed a degree before I moved into accountancy, and that's just not the case anymore. We see more and more of the employers that we work with who will recruit as many school leavers as they do graduates, sometimes even more school leavers. In fact, I've got a few employers that I work with who they would rather take a school leaver, train them from scratch through some of the fundamental qualifications, and then up through maybe the higher level chartered qualifications. They'd rather that than taking on a graduate who expects a higher salary, who expects really interesting work from day one, and perhaps doesn't really know anything for those years at university. So I think big growth in school leaver programs. Kind of linked to that, actually, is we've also seen a big growth in the use of apprenticeship programs. You may be aware that a few years ago there was a shift from the old apprenticeship frameworks to the current apprenticeship standards, and they just made the appropriateness of apprenticeship programs so much broader. I look at our typical intake at First Intuition. If I go back 5 years, perhaps 5% of our learners were apprentices. If I look now, it's probably 65%. It's literally been that extreme a change, and it's across the board now. So all of the qualifications, whether it's the AAT or ICAEW, CIMA, ACCA, whether it's school leavers, graduates now can actually do apprenticeships, different age ranges. So, I think apprenticeships have been, really significant change over the last few years. There's, a few other things as well. There's a much greater focus on kind of ethics and sustainability within the training programs, within the qualifications themselves. I think there's a recognition that accountants often, as well as being perhaps the financial compass of a business, sometimes also the moral compass of a business, and a part of the decision-making process, beyond just whether something's going to make money or make profit, looking at whether it's the right thing to do. And actually, I think, the last few months, this experience we've got of 2020 has probably really compounded the importance, I think, of those non-financial dimensions within business. So, that's something that the various awarding bodies have been really stressing in recent years. There's also been big changes in some of the practicalities of the way that students study. You can imagine with technology changing, there's more online delivery and virtual delivery of training and of courses. There's more online examining. And in fact, literally in recent months through the COVID pandemic, we've seen a shift towards remote invigilation. RI has become, the big buzz phrase of the last few months. So allowing students to actually sit exams at home or possibly in the office rather than going to a conventional, traditional exam centre. So that's all facilitated through, you can imagine, webcams, artificial intelligence, biometrics, and actually still having human invigilators watching through people's webcam facilities. And actually, you can imagine in the last few months particularly, that's been really useful to allow students to keep making progress with their exams, even when there are lockdowns or regional limitations on what people can do. But actually, that increasing use of technology for both the exams and the delivery, it's got pros and cons. It does increase flexibility and accessibility. The concern you sometimes find, though, particularly with students, is if students don't have a particular exam date to work towards, they sometimes don't really quite get round to sitting at the bane of my life is students saying, "I'll book the exam when I'm ready." And I think back, Hannah, to when I was a student, I was never ready to sit an exam, but I had to because it was a date in the calendar, and generally I got through them. I don't think anyone ever feels ready for their accountancy exams, and there's a danger with these on-demand computer-based exams that students just push them off, just delay, defer. I was talking to a student recently, really frustrating for her. She was considering coming to us to study, and she'd been studying the same subject for 18 months.
Wow.
Just had never quite felt ready to sit the exam, and kept delaying, deferring, thinking, I'll do a little bit more work. And a year and a half, she'd been effectively treading water, and now kicking herself that she hadn't sat the exam. So, there are potential downsides, I think, to the on-demand exams.
Absolutely. And in terms of the content, you mentioned sort of ethics is a key driver, and sustainability, which, I think for a lot of businesses is becoming much bigger on the agenda. Is there anything else in terms of the way that the content is changing, particularly for the sort of the upper levels of the exams, for those top level qualifications?
Yeah, I mean, the content, the various awarding bodies, they do work very hard to try and continually evolve their syllabuses, evolve the qualification content to make sure it is, relevant, fit for purpose, to make sure it's going to keep employers fundamentally satisfied. CIMA, as an example, they had a syllabus change last year where they brought in an awful lot of, quite future-focused finance elements, looking at kind of big data, looking at artificial intelligence, looking at blockchain, things that, even 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of people would barely have heard of. So all the institutes, they do try to move forward to introduce these new elements to their syllabuses. But fundamentally, actually, I think the basic skills that are trying to be developed in students are actually still quite similar. Yes, they need to be aware of some new, technical areas, but, they still need to build skills in, analysis. So being able to take a large scenario, to make sense of it, to break it down, to then look at potential problems in those scenarios. So weighing up different options they could take, some of which will have ethical dimensions, which they'll have to bring in. And then fundamentally about decision making. So coming up with a conclusion of what is it we should do in this situation, and then the communication. So actually making sure they can get over to whatever audience they have in their exam question, whether it be the board of directors or a client that they're reporting to, communicating all the distilled wisdom that they've gone through in all of that analysis. And I think fundamentally, it's still skills that, I still use to this day when I'm managing my business. It's always interesting, Hannah, because I often, I encounter former students quite regularly. They're often partners at firms we now work with, are often on the board of businesses that we train for. And I often ask them the question, how much of what I taught you 10, 15, 20 years ago do you still use? And often they dismissively say, oh, hardly any of it. But then they think, and they say, well, actually, I might not use much of the technical material, but I use the way it trained me to think. I use the way it trained me to approach problems and to analyze situations and to consider different stakeholder interests, to make sure I'm adopting non-financial as well as financial agendas within the decision-making process. And that's the thing I always really love, because my speciality tended to be those more strategic papers where there perhaps isn't one right answer. And it's interesting, you see some at the sort of higher level of some of the qualifications now, there sometimes isn't huge amounts of actual real accounting there anymore. It's much more around strategy. It's much more around looking at risks in businesses, looking at the controls they need to manage themselves effectively.
Do you know what? That's a really great observation, because one of the things we talk about a lot on the show is actually how that finance role is evolving. And I think it's such a shame that all these incredibly talented individuals that have been told, and taught to think strategically are spending their time on what I would call mundane tasks. And actually, for me, that's the exciting piece and the shift that we're seeing when we're working with clients is how is technology allowing them to enjoy their role more by getting into the bit that they've been trained for rather than the bit they have to do to get the numbers out, as it were. So and I actually think that's a really big shift, is that shift to more of a strategic troubleshooting, sort of forward thinking, risk assessment based qualification, rather than does this debit and this credit match. There's almost a, you have to know that, but actually that's not the value of a finance person, certainly not in my eyes. So it'd be great to understand. So how are you seeing that shift? Are you hearing that from the people that you're dealing with as well?
I think you're absolutely right there, actually, that, and it's something, there's a huge amount of automation that's coming into the accountancy process, the use of artificial intelligence. I look at our internal system, we use one of the cloud accounting platforms ourselves, and it automatically posts invoices without human interaction. It automatically reconciles our bank account. It's clever enough to do that without anybody helping. So, and this is, I guess, the fear that people would have is that therefore doing away with the job of accountants? Is it, are we going to be replaced by the boxes? Are we going to be replaced by the robots? But actually, to me, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's just changing the job that accountants do. It's taking away what fundamentally is pretty tedious, mind-numbing, repetitive transaction processing, the bit that always gave accountancy a pretty bad name, to be honest. It's replacing that and allowing us to do the more analytical side, the advisory stuff, the fun stuff. Actually, I quite agree with you. It's, for me, that's where the excitement and the interest really is.
I'm pretty sure no person decided to become accountant to type numbers into spreadsheets. That was not part of the job description. They're sold this dream of, being able to really drive businesses forward and help them answer questions, because finance is the place where you answer those questions. And I think it's fascinating. The more people I speak to on this podcast, the more I start to see these shifts happening. It's great to hear that the qualifications are actually now starting to reflect that reality and what's happening. So that's very exciting. So have you seen any other shifts in terms of what you're being asked for? Any shifts in what people are using?
Well, there's been a huge number of changes, over recent years. The kind of clients I work with, the kind of leaders that I talk to, they do say that actually, despite the widespread automation of transaction processing that we've talked about, they do always stress that fundamental bookkeeping, fundamental accountancy knowledge still completely critical.
Yes.
Accountants, they even though they may not be processing the transactions, they still need to understand what's going on. I know Mike Dow's one of the directors at Xero, and he always uses the expression, they need to know what's going on under the bonnet. They still need to understand their debits, their credits, their double entry. They still need to understand trial balances. They need to understand suspense accounts and journals. So that's not going away, or even though perhaps the accountants aren't actually doing that work day to day in the workplace anymore. You can imagine, the analogy people tend to use is if something goes wrong and you've got to unpick it, you've got to understand what's gone on in the first place. You need to understand how to post a journal to make the corrections. And also, I think, to analyze the output of the systems. The thing I often say is that whereas accountancy used to be very input driven, it's much more output driven now. It's much more about taking the results of your system and making sense of it and communicating, conclusions to either your own management team or to your client. But to interpret that output, you've got to understand what was going on inside it. I hear the phrase often, I was talking to a former student of mine recently, and she's FD of a small tech company now, doing really well. And she said when she sits down with her CEO to explain how transactions work, they get the bits of paper out, they get the T accounts out. And as she puts it, if in doubt, T account. literally to show. So when they're doing something like accruing income, you've got to show both impacts of it, and it makes sense, therefore, to use double entry principles to show that as well as a P&L impact, there's also a balance sheet impact. So, those fundamental skills still used by, people at board level. And in fact, this to me is, going back to that point around school leaver programs, which we've seen a big growth of, they would normally be done in conjunction with the AAT qualification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, as a technician qualification, I think it's fantastic. I've got a huge amount of respect for the AAT as a qualification, because it really embeds those fundamental double entry skills, those suspense account skills that, literally those trainees might then still be using when they're a CFO many, many years later. If I'm teaching a final level chartered or CIMA or certified class, if I'm teaching students who are within weeks of qualifying as full professional accountants, I can always tell the ones who did AAT versus the ones who came through the graduate route, even if they're relevant graduates, to be honest. If I'm honest, I'm not sure what they're teaching on accountancy degrees these days, because it doesn't appear to be double entry, because, you can always tell the students who did AAT because they still know what a journal is. They can still post depreciation or whatever it might be. So, to see that route, school leaver route, coming in, doing AAT, using that as a springboard into one of the chartered qualifications, doing it all through apprenticeships. It's a 5-year process. You sometimes see fully qualified accountants at 23, perhaps even, managers in their firms at that stage. I mean, it's such an incredibly powerful, turbocharge at the start of people's careers, I think.
No, and to be fair, I have a lot of respect for the AAT qualification. We put our support guys. So people often say, you're techies, you support accounting software. I'm like, no. We have to be good at both. And for us, that starts with the basics. So, do they know their double entry? And can we put it? So we actually put our guys through. So I 100% support what you're saying. I'm a massive believer in, you've got to know the basics, until you can't do the really interesting, analysis until you actually got the basics. You might never use it, but you need to know it. And I think that is the piece. So when you're looking at that P&L and the balance sheet, can you see where it's going wrong? Because if you don't understand those T accounts, how on earth are you going to spot the differences? Because that for me is where, the roles are starting to come in, is they're not spending their time entering this information, they're spending their time interpreting it. And if you can't spot where things are going wrong, you've got a big problem. So 100%.
And even, those years I spent doing my own training and, being an auditor particularly, and then, now I teach double entry, so obviously I'm pretty familiar with it, but, I've got this almost magical ability of, if I look at 2 pages of numbers, I can almost unerringly spot where the issues are, and you can spot where something's gone a bit wrong, and it just becomes this kind of sixth sense, because probably, and it's something, particularly going back to this shift towards school leaver programs. I often talk to 16, 17-year-olds who are considering careers in finance, and one of the number one questions that I get from them is, I'm not very mathematical, I'm not very good at maths, that means I can't be an accountant, doesn't it? And I say, no, not at all. That doesn't matter. You do not need to be mathematical to be an accountant. Being numerate is no bad thing. So being able to, play with numbers is great. But, as long as you can add, subtract, multiply, divide, that's about as mathematical as accountancy tends to ever get. I mean, I do homework with my 14-year-old daughter now, and she's doing stuff that's way more mathematically challenging than anything I teach my accountants.
Well, I'm going to be honest and say my background's mathematics, and I can honestly say I haven't applied any, apart from the problem solving. Yeah, I didn't see a number for about 3 years when I did maths at university. It was all letters. So, numbers don't really have much to do with maths at the top level. So we're all good. Yeah, people shouldn't let that put them off. So,
and I mean, even that numerate side of it. And I was talking to one of my recently qualified accountants recently. So she did. She was a school leaver, came straight in, did her qualifications. Very successful. She works for one of the big 4 firms. Just qualified as a full accountant and promoted to manager at a big 4 firm. And she is 23. It's an incredible achievement at a young age, and there's no way. And she even admits there's no way she could have achieved that if she'd gone to university. She'd probably only be about 18 months out of university at 23. But she said to me, actually, now that she'd been promoted to manager, she won't be doing much in the way of numbers anymore. It'll all be about people. It'll all be about working with her team and training and support and communication, which, going back to the point you were asking earlier about changes in kind of what accountants do, that I think is a big, big change. And it feeds in with the apprenticeships that we mentioned, that I think professional accountants are being called to draw on a far wider range of interpersonal skills at a much earlier age. So, a manager at 23. And I hear stories from clients who have, they have school leavers who are talking to clients and advising clients within 6 weeks of leaving school. So, 18, 19-year-olds who are giving clients face-to-face direct advice. Again, I remember when I was training, when I was a graduate, bear in mind, it was at least 2 years before they let me loose on talking to clients. Up until then, it was ticking bank statements and doing reconciliations and stuff. And, so I think, the qualifications, the awarding bodies, the apprenticeships, which are fantastic for this, they need to deliver a much broader range of kind of career relevant skills than just the technical knowledge. In fact, I spent a lot of 2019 talking to employers, talking to the awarding bodies. Remember, I had Mark Farrar, who's the chief exec of the AAT. He came to visit my office in Cambridge, and I set up a forum with a number of local employers who use AAT. And it was all about what skills do professional accountancy trainees need in their journey towards qualification. And the weird thing is, nobody said accountancy. Nobody mentioned accountancy, because that's kind of a given. They assume they're going to know what a bank rec is and they're going to know what contribution is. It was all around communication, teamwork, adaptability. You can imagine how important that's been in the last few months. Adaptability, flexibility, decision making, critical thinking, leadership. And actually, this for me goes back to that. To me, in 25 years of training accountants, the single biggest change by a country mile has been these new apprenticeship standards, and particularly the skills and behaviours that they kind of overlay alongside the technical knowledge. And I think, I think they're fantastic. They're so fit for purpose for, my vision of a future finance leader who, yes, has got to have the finance skills, but also needs a much broader array of leadership skills, which, typically are not trained formally in the way that, how to work out gross profit is, or how to work out, contribution is. They get years of formal training in that. And then, as we've heard, by the age of 23, they're not doing it anymore. And actually, they're going to spend the rest of their career doing stuff they often don't get much in the way of formal training in. So this is what I love about the apprenticeship programs, is, really embedding in a very robust, very, I think, reliable way all these other skills and behaviors.
Do you know what? I think that's a really good point. And I loved your comment around, how when you first started, they hid you away from the clients for 2 years. And, because you were spending your time doing those tick box style tasks that are now being done by the technology. And for me, that's, it's exciting to learn that people are progressing faster because technology. People who see technology as sort of a bad thing, that it's going to take away jobs, but actually just creates different ones. But like you say, you've got to have those incredible sort of leadership communication skills that aren't traditionally, by the sounds of it, haven't been in the syllabus, and that are now starting to creep through. And you mentioned apprenticeships are starting to get them in. Are the higher level ones actually starting to have an element of leadership, of conflict management, of people management as well?
Absolutely, and having difficult conversations with people. So, and they're right across the board. So, apprenticeships basically consist of 3 key elements. There's knowledge, which is the sort of exam-focused technical stuff like working at profits or tax or whatever. You've then got the skills, which are these, I think, more broad career skills. They're the things that are annoyingly always described as soft skills, which I hate that phrase. I really hate it. Soft skills makes them sound like they're not that important. and it makes them sound like they're kind of easy, as I'm sure a lot of us would recognize. The soft skills are the hard ones. They're the really important ones that actually, they're the ones that dictate the distance in your career, I think. If you're banking your finance career on being able to do bank recs and tax computations, you're already irrelevant, let alone in a few years' time. The distance of your career is dictated by your interpersonal skills, your negotiation skills, handling difficult situations, handling conflict, stakeholder management, and absolutely. So these are the skills that are embedded in the apprenticeship standards. And then you've got the behaviours, and the behaviours really is all about making sure that the knowledge and the skills are actually adopted in the workplace and actually make a difference to how you behave and how you act in your job. Because I'm sure you'll have had experiences like me, Hannah, where you go and do a day of training and it doesn't affect what you do at all, because you go back to the workplace and you go back to the olden ways that you've always done it. So, one of the things we do in our programs for apprentices, as well as having the tutors that do the traditional job of teaching tax and net present value calculations, we've got a whole new set of staff called coaches, and they're actually responsible for the apprentices. They're responsible for the learners' development in all of these skills and behaviours, so making sure that they're taking them back to the workplace, that they're given development tasks to, so for instance, if they've done their communication skills unit, they'll go to the workplace and they'll run an internal meeting and make sure that they do a presentation or record it so it can be uploaded as evidence to show that it's actually making a difference over the period of their program to how they're able to work, and therefore the value that they're delivering to their employers, and a value that I think is, the coming months are going to be challenging for businesses, for individuals, for the economy. And these, I think, are the skills that are going to really make the difference to actually steering our local and national economies through, the COVID recovery and the post-Brexit situation as well. We've got a lot to deal with. And I think these apprenticeship standards really give an awful lot of the core skills that are going to really help everyone.
And do you know what? I think having had loads of, because this is one of the subjects I'm really passionate about. So in terms of developing, especially the young up and comings, as it were, both from, because obviously we've got support staff, we've got junior consultants coming through. And one of the interesting things is that I think as the graduates and those young people so focused on getting the piece of paper that demonstrates they have the knowledge and the academic achievement, and actually what they haven't quite got is that actually what the employers value is, like you say, those soft skills, their ability to communicate, to lead team, to model those behaviors. And you're right, those are the bits that are going to drive their success and drive their value as an employee, and also to your clients. So it's great to hear that that's coming through, and we're starting to see those shifts, because it isn't something that the finance profession is known for. Let's be really honest. When somebody describes an accountant, what is it that they think of? And if we take that impression and then we actually take a step back and look at what you guys are delivering in terms of the quality of candidates, that's an amazing shift, that actually you're more focused on the application of those skills in the workplace than you are, they've got to have the technical, and I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. But actually it's really exciting to hear that there's such a shift in the soft skills, and there's got to be a better word for soft skills than that.
We should have a competition, I think, Anna, because I quite agree. I think they need renaming, because it's like soft drinks. It's a bit kind of fluffy and meaningless,
isn't it?
Yeah, and they're not at all. I mean, and the thing is, I look back at my career, and when I was training, if I was lucky, I got one day a year where I went off to a country house with all my colleagues, and you get told if you were red, green, or blue, and then you'd play some games, and it's a bit of a token gesture for all this interpersonal stuff. With these new apprenticeship standards, these new programs, it's really embedded as part of those programs from the very, very start. And I did an interesting exercise with a client recently. So the client had their auditors in, and they knew that the auditors had recently started adopting apprenticeships, and they knew some of the audit team were apprentices and some weren't. And the FD I was chatting to, he'd done a little exercise with himself as he tried to guess which of them were apprentices and which of them weren't, just by the way they carried themselves, the way they communicated, the confidence that they showed. And he said he got it bang on. When he actually talked to them afterwards,
Really?
he got it bang on. He could tell which of them were apprentices, and they weren't necessarily the most experienced or the oldest at all. In fact, some of them were relatively new school leavers who, and to me, that's the other thing. It's not just the specific career skills, if we can call them career skills rather than soft skills, but it's not just the specific skills they're getting in things like team working, negotiation, problem solving. It was the kind of professional confidence they were building. Because the apprenticeships, as I've said, they have tasks, so they have to go and demonstrate these in the workplace, and they get feedback. And apprenticeships also involve a huge amount of sort of self-review. You're supposed to, reflect on what you do regularly to see, we all know reflection on how we're performing and identifying what we could do better and what we do different. We know that's a fundamental part of learning, but we just never have time to do it, do you? You never kind of sit down. But apprentices are kind of forced to do it as part of their programs. And that alone, I think, makes a powerful difference to, the progression they make, the fact they are kind of constantly reflecting on what they need to do to improve.
And it's great to hear like the next generation of finance leaders are coming through with those skills. But what about those that have already completed their CMAT or, and have done the old syllabus that didn't necessarily contain all this great, people skills and core competencies in the workplace? Is there anything that's being done to support those that want to sort of engage and outside of that, or are they going down the alternative route of, sort of CMI, etc.?
Well, I mean, there is always CPD, and CPD, it's, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer every year. And this year is a very good example that, I forget who said it, but somebody once said, the day you're done learning, you're done. You've got to constantly keep learning, even at my age and at my position, you've got to keep learning new stuff. And so, CPD is, what you need it to be in your situation, in your workplace, in your business. So, for a lot of people, that CPD will be almost trying to incorporate some of the elements that, young learners are getting as part of their programs. You mentioned CMI actually, and it's one of the things we've developed at First Intuition in the last couple of years is we're starting to roll out a leadership and management program in conjunction with the CMI. So we've got a level 3 and a level 5 program, which, we have apprentices doing that because, we are seeing so many of our, newly qualified accountants being promoted into positions of responsibility at very young ages and need that support and training. So for us, it's fantastic. It gives us an opportunity to, if we've had a school leaver from 17 up to 23 through their accountancy journey, we can now take them another year or two through their, initial leadership journey. So, I know a lot of organizations are starting to take formal training in areas like leadership and management with the CMI or, some of the other leadership institutes. That is being taken a lot more seriously. But I do think, organizations clearly have a role to play in making sure their various staff are upskilled in the right way, but it's something individuals, you've got to take this very seriously. I was actually on the conference call with the CBI earlier, and they were saying they've done some research that shows that 9 out of 10 employees in the country will need some form of pretty significant reskilling in the next decade. So basically all of us. So I think every single one of us needs to take a big responsibility for our own development, whether that be, leadership skills, digital skills, which are clearly going to be very relevant to an awful lot of roles going forward. But we've got, got to be proactive and take that responsibility ourselves, I think.
No, absolutely. And I think there is a bit of ownership, isn't there, on, on individuals within a team. To make sure that they know where they want to go, because that's always the hard bit, especially when they're a bit younger, is actually figuring out what's coming next. And so for those that are running teams or have a team and they're wanting to think, right, this is my team for the next 5 years, what are your top tips for making sure that they have the skills to actually drive that finance team forwards?
Well, I think firstly, in the short term, don't be tempted to cut back on recruitment at entry level. which I think would be a natural knee-jerk reaction to a situation like this. But I've been very reassured actually in recent months that the employers I work with have all carried on with their pre-COVID recruitment plans. In fact, a lot of them have referenced the 2008-9 financial crash, when a lot of people did cut back recruitment dramatically and actually really suffered for it 4 or 5 years later, when they didn't have effectively an entire generation of newly qualified senior staff. In fact, I know organisations that are still suffering now at senior progression level. They can't find the partners that they should have recruited back in 2008-9. So a lot of organisations have said, right, we don't want to repeat that mistake. So we are still going to bring in those entry-level school leavers, because fundamentally, a school leaver, particularly if they're being trained under an apprenticeship, it's not a massive cost to the business at the end of the day. The bigger cost would be not having those staff a few years down the line. So I think firstly, don't be tempted to cut back recruitment in the short term, because you may well regret it in the medium to long term. I think building a robust school leaver program, and the sort of thing we've been talking about, using the likes of AAT, use the AAT qualification to build those fundamental double entry skills, as fundamental knowledge that we've already been talking about a bit earlier. I think, that part of that school leaver program is, having positive engagement with local schools, local colleges, which perhaps a lot of organisations have not really done in the past. It's actually something we've been drawn into much more at First Intuition, is much stronger relationships with schools for careers fairs and recruitment events, which really we didn't tend to do a few years ago. We talked a bit about apprenticeships, but I think using the apprenticeship programs to support trainees, and in accountancy you can do that from kind of level 2 to 3 to 4 to 7. So actually you can take the whole range from school leaver all the way up to fully qualified chartered accountants. So a good, solid, engaged apprenticeship program with a good training provider, I think, would be a really necessary part of that. Within that trainee program, I think what I see a lot of the more successful programs doing is having a degree of trainee rotation around different parts of the organisation. So rather than staying in one silo for 3 or 4 years, actually moving around maybe a few months in different parts of the business. Because particularly, you can imagine when somebody gets higher up in the organisation, that kind of more holistic organisational familiarity of all the different parts of the business really helps if they're then trying to run the whole shooting match, rather than think, well, I've only ever really worked in purchase ledger, or I've only ever worked in treasury. So I think, rotation is really good for building those future leader potential. And, clearly you don't want to put all this effort into recruiting school leavers, putting them on apprenticeship programs, training them through their AAT, through their chartered qualifications, and then them leave. So I think a real focus on retention after qualification is obviously critical to then retaining their ability, their skills. That would include, I guess, things like making sure there are good career progression paths, having mentoring with some of the senior leaders of the organisation, obviously recognising people's achievements, giving them autonomy and decision-making power in what they're doing, giving them challenging and rewarding work to keep them interested, a bit like I've had for 25 years now at First Intuition. And perhaps fundamentally a sense of purpose in what they're doing, both for their own job, but also for the organisation. I think, the younger generations these days are much more interested in a sense of belonging to an organisation with a bigger purpose than just themselves. So I think, all of those things hopefully ensure that you retain that talent that you've invested so heavily in building at the beginning of their careers. And they will, and in fact, I was talking to somebody, one of the partners of the firm we work with, who really loves apprenticeships and really embraced it. And she put it quite succinctly, which was, we're not training accountants, we're developing future leaders, which, I thought said it in a nutshell, really.
I think it does, actually, and that's a great way to sum up what a finance training program should be. It's not developing accountants, it's building the finance leaders of the future. And I think there's always that piece that should be in the back of any leader's mind at the moment, is how do I build the people that are going to replace me? Because if you have that amazing team underneath you, you are going to go far. That's a brilliant way to sum up the podcast. So thank you so much, Gareth. It's been really insightful. And if our audience wants to learn more about what you do at First Intuition, what's the best way to sort of reach out and get hold of you?
We have a website, so www.firstintuition.co.uk, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, continually posting around what's going on with apprenticeships, what's going on with the qualifications, my view on, challenges in regional economies. So just look for Gareth John, look for probably a silly shirt, and feel free to link with me. I love building my LinkedIn community.
Absolutely. And I think because that is exactly where I found you. I must admit the silly shirt caught the attention, as it should. But yeah,
we've got to have a personal brand, haven't you?
Absolutely. And for anyone that's listening that wants to reach out, we will put your LinkedIn profile and a link to your website in the show notes. So listener, obviously have a look at those guys and, do connect in, and, you've got some great content coming out. So thank you, Gareth, for joining us. It's been lovely to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.